morning and welcome everyone to City Futures Open workshop this morning on the current level of service. To open our workshop, Hautapu, please.
Ai, morena kia tātou, me noi tātou. He honore kurorea ki te atua he maungarongo ki te whenua e whakaaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa. Hanga e te atua he ngā hau ki roto ki tēnā o tātou, whakatongi a tau wairua tapu he āwhina. Hei tohi i a mātou i roto i tēnei whare, kurorea ki tō ingoa tapu. Aimine.
Thank you very much, Councillor Baker. I'd like to hand over to Jeremy now to get us started.
We're open to questions as you go through it. This is for your understanding, so while we've got a bit of a structure to run through, if you've got things you want to say and want to ask, then feel free. Vicky.
Tēnā koutou. Is that working? Oh, right, and the whole thing moves. Oh, okay. Is it possible to have my PowerPoint now? Is that? Oh, is it on? Oh, yep. Sorry, my first time using this. Oh, why is it doing that? I think while we wait, I can probably do a little bit of the intro. Yeah, so as Jeremy said, the purpose for this workshop is to run you through the kind of content and why we have this lead level of service policy, to let you know a bit more about the changes that we proposed to the policy when we took it to you in May, and to get your feedback on any further changes that you'd like to see potentially brought back to you for your decision on whether to adopt for consultation this policy. So we're going to cover over why we have the policy, the core kind of elements of the policy, what we propose to change. We're going to break up for a few case study examples that you'll work through in groups and just get a sense of how some of these criteria in the policy work and direct staff to do different things. And then we'll come back together for a bit of a discussion on any feedback that you have and any future changes you might like to see. So what is the point of this policy? So the reason we have the lead level of service policy, there's three main reasons. So the first is that, oh, here we go.
One more, Caroline.
Two more, actually, I think. Oh, yeah. And sorry, one more again, Caroline. So we've got three reasons for having this policy. So the first is that it acts as a guidance document for staff, and so that's part of why we're refreshing it now too. So we're coming into preparing for an LTP, and so what this policy does is it provides some guidance to staff around when we're coming to you with a level of service, what sort of analysis should they be doing ahead of presenting that level of service. So it works as a bit of a roadmap for staff when they're considering changes. It provides some criteria there for them to work through. The other aspect of this policy is it provides some transparency to the community about how we set levels of service, so that way the community knows what we might consider or present to you to consider as part of a level of service. And within the policy, there are a few policy positions on kind of reasons why you might consider a higher level of service in a certain area of the city. So it gives some indication of when that might be justified. So it contains those policy positions in this policy. So as part of refreshing this policy, we're also keen to provide a bit of an educational update to staff to say, you know, this is what you need to do when you're preparing a level of service, so that way when it feeds into the LTP planning, you guys are getting a consistent approach towards that kind of analysis that you're receiving. So that's why we're doing this now. So how do levels of service fit into Council's performance management framework? So a level of service is one part of the decisions that get made, but it's not every part. So overall, Council is trying to achieve the community outcomes that you kind of set through the long-term plan. And as part of that, you set a strategic direction on how you plan to achieve those outcomes. And there are basically two kind of different ways that you can set about achieving those outcomes. You can do it through your levels of service, which is kind of your BAU delivery, so everything you do normally, just as standard. And you can also do it through discrete investments. So these are more, say, community grants or business cases or one-off kind of decisions to invest a little bit more somewhere. So combine together those kind of everyday standard levels of service and your kind of investment decision should combine to try and achieve your community outcomes that you're trying to reach. So the other aspect of this is that not every activity of council requires a level of service, so there will be some activities that council just does. But for the ones that really are important to achieving those community outcomes, it's good to have a level of service set so that you can be benchmarking and tracking. And part of a level of service is also setting a performance measure, which is that kind of check on whether you're delivering the level of service as you've intended. So yeah. So now we're just going to kind of go through some core elements within the policy. So just the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So we have a little bit of time at the end to kind of discuss the feedback we've heard already about the policy and potentially the language, but in here I've just used the language, the council and TCC staff to just help with that clarification of who's doing what. So these are the refreshed principles that we were proposing, and further along in the session we'll go through what we've changed and why in a bit more detail. But basically, these principles set out that the council, so you, will make informed decisions on the levels of service, considering the strategic, practical, and financial implications of the desired level of service. That the council and TCC staff will clearly communicate to the community what level of service will be delivered, when and at what cost, and how this will be reported on and monitored. So again, that's that transparency. The council will aim to provide an equitable service to the community and consider fairness and equity when setting levels of service or transitioning to a new level of service. The council may provide a differentiated level of service when the council considers this justified, as outlined in this policy. So that's where we talked about how some areas may potentially be justified in having a higher level of service. And then next slide, please, Caroline. So as I kind of mentioned before, not every activity that council does requires a formal level of service. So the policy sets out that these should be focused on those which are either legally required to be disclosed, so there's certain like water, ones which we have to report on legislatively, or they relate to a significant activity of council. Or also, it's often used when it's linked to investment or funding decisions. So, for example, if something is tied to a targeted rate or a development contribution, then that might be a reason for which to articulate a formal level of service. Thank you. So the policy also sets out how we will consult on levels of service. So legislatively, we're required to consult on significant changes to levels of service for significant activities. And once they've been established, then they start to be recorded either in the long-term plan and the annual plan, or they may be in specific policies or strategies. So then the next kind of chunky section of the policy is around setting levels of service. So we're going to go through a couple of these bullets here, but then the grunt of it we're going to do in a kind of little case study example in a bit. So in this section it sets out where the level of service is described, whether this should be in the long-term plan, in a policy or in a strategy, how the level of service is described, and what performance measures to set for the level of service. So describing a level of service. So when you're setting a level of service, you have a choice around what kind of measure you want to use. So it could be feedback or satisfaction based. How much did people like the activity that you've provided? It could be a quantitative measure, like how much of something did you deliver, or how far was it from someone's house, or like how much per person did we provide, population based. It could be qualitative measures, so that's a little bit trickier as a level of service, but we do have some, say for open space, in terms of features of open space like site identity and wellbeing. And you can have use-based measures, which is, you know, how many people visited the art gallery, how many people did a certain activity program that we offered, those types of measures. And so I think within the policy, we're trying to support staff and for you as council to make sure that whatever you're choosing is really measurable and able to be quantified. But the actual intention of the measure is really about council achieving its strategic priorities. So making sure you're measuring something that you actually want to measure and get done. And that kind of sits with you as council to make sure that you're happy with, you know, what you've selected. But the policy is really about making sure that those measures are going to actually be monitorable, measurable, and able to be checked.
And just while we're on this one, because we're in workshop mode, there's a real crossover between level of service and performance measure. And a level of service, the policy says it's controllable by council. And of course, some of these performance measures that you will see are about people's satisfaction, which isn't controllable by council. We could provide 1,000 widgets a week, and people want 400 widgets a week, and they still won't be satisfied for whatever reason. So you might end up with we're not satisfied with 1,000 widgets a week, we want something else, and then you provide something else, and they're still not satisfied. So while the performance measure helps describe the level of service, it's not actually the level of service itself. The level of service is probably what you can control, which is we'll produce 1,000 widgets. So the crossover there, and it's a fine line. Some things it's very difficult for council to actually define what you are providing, and therefore the outcome is more measured by a qualitative performance measure on satisfaction. Trust and confidence is the classic one. You know, how can you deliver a level of service on trust and confidence, but you can definitely measure people's perceptions of trust and confidence. So there's a grey middle piece in the Venn diagram, shall we say. So not all levels of service can be measured with satisfaction, and all satisfaction measures are definitely not necessarily themselves levels of service, but there is a crossover.
Sorry, Vicky, interruptions.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt again. Given what you just said, Jeremy, like, how do we review them and know that they're right? Or do we review them? How often do we do that?
As far as what the measures are in totality, we've got 1,200 people, we've got 30 activities. We generally get complaints that there's too many performance measures in the LTP, which is 70, 80, 90. So you collectively go, have we got the right breadth? The auditors do the same thing. They will come in and look at, does the overall performance framework cover the key aspects of the key activities of council? They don't want it to cover everything. So we could have a level of service for left-hand opening small library books, and we don't. We have a level of service around opening hours, which we can control, the amount of stock, which we can control, the number of libraries, which you can control, but not on all those minor levels of satisfaction. So you look at it overall and go, does this portray the key aspects of what this council is doing for its community? And you will disagree amongst yourselves, you'll disagree with your predecessors, and you'll probably disagree with your successors. And that's fine, we'll just create a slightly different set. 90% of what's in there will survive year or LTP to LTP, and there'll be some tweaks around the edges.
Then there's the section of the policy which talks about when council might consider a higher level of service in an area of the city. So remembering we have the general principle that it should be equitable across the city. So in order to provide something different in an area, we're saying it needs to generally be justified. And so the reasons that we've got there is that it would be consistent with the strategic direction of council. So say, for example, accessibility hotspots, we're wanting to provide a higher level of accessibility in a certain area. We may therefore have a higher level of accessible play in that particular area compared to another. It might be where it supports high density residential zones, so recognising that where you've got high density residential areas, you might need to provide a slightly elevated level of service in order to improve the livability of those areas. Where it supports comprehensive development areas. This is a term for kind of areas that are planned, like a development or a subdivision, And for this part of the policy, it does require that if there is a higher level of service for, say, that development or subdivision, that gets paid for by the residents of that subdivision through a targeted rate. So say, for example, you want more street trees in an area, that's okay, but you're going to need to pay the ongoing operational cost of that, is what the policy currently says. And then there is a provision around special character areas, which is defined within the policy. It's not a planning term. And it's around areas with like a unique characteristic. So things like the beach, where you might have a higher level of service for, say, amenities like seating or barbecue because people are going to be there, or central business districts or historic areas. So that's kind of that purpose of that part.
So one of the origins of this policy being written in 2005 was the conversations with the developers of the lakes at the time. And they were very keen. Oh, sorry. One of the origins of this policy back in 2005 was the conversations with the developers of the lakes, which was happening back at the time before Caris were involved back in the Grasshopper days. They were very keen to have a heightened level of service, particularly around green space and foliage cover generally and bushes, and you see that out there now. The conversation with the council at the time was along the lines of, well, that's all very well, but who's paying for it? Because the rest of the city doesn't have that, and why should the rest of us pay for that? And eventually, through the development of the level of service policy and the conversations which preceded it, that's where the targeted rate for the lakes came in. If you want all this extra stuff which needs to be maintained in perpetuity, then we can create the targeted rate to help fund it. The aim of doing that at a comprehensive development area level was, that's all very well when there was 2,000 properties planned out there. We're not doing this on a street by street level. If Street A comes to us and says we want 3 more trees, let's have a targeted rate for the next 25 years to pay for the upkeep. That was not envisaged. But where you've got a comprehensive development area, a large piece of land, developed generally by one developer, possibly it might be a couple of developers sometimes, then the conversation door was open. And that's where this policy became very useful at that time.
So now we just have a little bit of time to go through the changes proposed in the policy, and then we'll break into groups to do a bit more of the kind of substance of the policy around the criteria we look at for analysis. So on your desk you should have a handout, hopefully, with the table of changes and also a draft policy with the track changes in red. So just taking you through from the beginning here, so just starting off with the purpose of the policy, we've just popped in there that the purpose of the policy is also to be consistent with the revenue and financing policy, so that's a requirement. We've added in a scope section that just provides a bit of that detail around the fact that the policy applies to describing levels of service in the long-term plan, annual plan, council policies and strategic documents, and just clarifying that it does not relate to operationally agreed standards of provision. So say, for example, things like in contractual arrangements and those sorts of things, it does need to be a formal level of service. And then we move into the background where we've updated this to move away from what was a kind of legislative context approach, which was also just out of date with the current legislation, to provide a bit more kind of background around how levels of service fit in within council performance frameworks. That's what we just talked about earlier in terms of that, relationship with trying to achieve those community outcomes and the fact that you can still provide discrete investments outside of your levels of service. And there's also just a bit more information there around levels of service and how they relate to development contributions and the importance of having a measurable level of service in order to support the collection of development contributions. Any questions there? Or?
Just a couple of queries. Accepting land in lieu, what does that mean?
So, for example, like through a development agreement, you might have a developer who provides us with parks and reserves rather than us collecting development contributions in order to purchase the land and build the playground. It might be an agreement with a developer to provide that playground and that land as part of that development in order to meet the requirements that's needed for that subdivision.
And the section on transitioning, that's sort of been deleted and sort of watered down. Is it taken care of somewhere in this? I didn't quite pick it up. That's on page 7.
Oh, right, sorry, I was just going in parts. We'll
Oh, sorry.
still be, sorry, we'll still be moving through. I was just going, yep. So we're
Oh, when you get to it, that's good.
through background and then into definitions. Cool. So yeah, for the definitions, we've updated the comprehensive development area definition just to be less specific because these things can date, but provide that kind of framework for what we're meaning there. So a comprehensively planned geographic area, and it also reflects the fact that the city plan, since the time that this is adopted, has been updated and no longer references those points. We have included a definition for high-density residential zone to match the changes to the city plan with Plan Change 33. And as such, that replaces the intensification area definition. And then we're kind of into principles now. So with the principles, we kind of ran through them earlier, but the changes we proposed in the policy was around, I guess, reflecting the actual content of the policy a bit more. So the original principles didn't really specify the fact that, you know, the purpose of the policy is to make sure that council is making those informed decisions considering the strategic, practical and financial implications. And also that the council, you know, is going to clearly communicate to the community what the level of service will be delivered and what cost and reported on monitored. And we've just done a tweak in the equity principle just to actually say the names of those sections that we're talking about. So in the original principle, it says achieve fairness and equity, having particular regards to sections 5.1 and 5.4. So it now just says when setting levels of service or transitioning to a new level of service, just to be clearer about what we're talking about there. And we've removed the principle to meet legislative requirements because you are required to do that anyway. So it's just a little redundant. Any questions on those, Hautapu?
Morena kōrua. Really cool discussion, and I have questions, other questions later at a more poignant time, but just looking at with what we've discussed so far and what's proposed to be changed, why, and this is more so for my own learning, but why is a level of service policy centred around growth and development? It seems like, and like a big chunk that is missing for me is our responsibility to our environment. Like we've got special character areas, but that's quite a light touch. And I'm looking at some of the wording around it's all to do with just growth and development and making sure we're providing a service in that area, but not the reciprocal relationship that we should in turn have with taking care of our natural environment. Considering it's the thing that makes tauranga, I would assume that that's something we really take care of in our level of service and that's considered.
Potentially we could update the principles to reflect that further. I do think doing the exercise in a few minutes where we kind of work through the criteria of setting a level of service and moving to a level of service will bring in kind of the strategic aspect, which does kind of talk to, you know, our environment strategy and other ways that we incorporate that vision for Tauranga into the levels of service we set. So recognise that so far we have been kind of focusing more on the, I guess, context and technical aspect of the policy rather than the guts of it, which we're going to do in a workshop session. So is it all right if we come back to that at the end and just talk about it a bit more and see whether it's covered off or whether we want to...
Is it normal practice for a council's level of service policy, though, to be anchored around development and growth? Or is that just an us thing?
So I'll just hop in from the back benches. So one of the key roles of the level of service policy is to set the level of service so the development contribution policy can be given effect to. So one of the things in development contribution is to require growth to pay for the required level of service. So a lot of the environmental aspects come through the environmental strategies and the action and investment plans and other elements, and the environmental elements of growth get dealt with through the national policy statements and the zoning and other elements. So the issues that you were asking for are addressed, but they're addressed through different documents. This is one of the key roles, is to set the level of service so we can charge development contributions across growth areas. So that's yes, but in other processes.
Sorry, just one more question, if that's all right.
Workshop.
So when the dust is settled and we're growthed out, so to speak, this policy policy remains as this. This is still effectively what level of service looks like on a day-to-day outside of growth and development contributions, right? Or no?
Yes, but one of its primary roles is to set the level of service for the development contributions. You make a series of other decisions about how you want to invest in things like environment, and you make those through your action and investment plans, through your respective long-term plans and annual plans. So we'll pick them up, and you could add them in here, but it's probably not required. There's enough other mechanisms through all your other elements in your strategy and your planning framework that you don't need to duplicate. Okay. And some of the feedback we've had in the past is that we try to make every policy do everything, and actually we're better to have tailored policies that are trying to deal with specific issues and do those well, rather than making them broad brush and sort of cover every possibility and not deal with the key things that they need to. Yeah. So those elements, though, you're talking about are not ignored. They are strongly dealt with through other mechanisms.
Okay. Yeah. All right, thank you.
So just a quick one from the chair. Perhaps we could have either Jeremy or Christine. This is the lead level of service document. So from this document, all the other documents that Christine has talked about and Jeremy's hinted at drop out of this for different specific levels of service. So this is the overarching one by which the council operates out of, and everything drops. This gives the overall guidance for the whole organisation, how they move forward to meet the levels of service in different areas around Tauranga. Have I got that about right?
It's how we set them, yes, but I think kind of the piece you're talking about in terms of the vision and direction that we're heading, that's through our strategic framework, and so I'm hoping with the activity we can see how that comes through a bit more. But yeah, as Christine says, we kind of want to have one source of truth on that sort of thing, and so it doesn't necessarily need to sit in this policy, but it needs to refer to those strategies to make sure that they're given effect to.
The strategic framework is coming to a workshop near you on the 24th of July. So that'll give you that wider suite.
Oh, what? Sorry.
I think your mic's on.
Oh, is it? Oh, great. Yeah, because I think when this first came up, I was one of the ones that was concerned about this policy because it looked overarching over everything. And in that case, I felt that the treaty and some principles of it, cultural principles, need to be included. But actually, this policy doesn't overarch everything. It's more operational stuff. Also, I think the concerns that I had in the cultural sense actually covered in the, I think, as Christine told me, the significance and consultation policy, which overarches this policy. So actually what I'm trying to do now is grasp what this does cover, this policy, and how that all fits in.
Yeah, and I think maybe we move into the workshop part with the examples shortly. So I'll just skim through the last of these, if that's all right, or Rod, sorry.
Well, I completely agree with what our TAP has been talking about, and I don't wonder whether the title of this is incorrect. Perhaps it should be more directed to development contributions, if that's specifically what it's dealing with, rather than the general stuff. I think we need to think about whether the naming is right.
So just maybe quickly moving through the other changes. So we've added a section in around clarifying which council activities will require a formal level of service. So that's where we talked about legally required, significant activity, or linked to funding decisions. We talk about generally we'll aim to set a level of service through the LTP, but there might be occasions where we do that through a policy or strategy, and it sets out why that might be, which is generally when it's got way too much detail to include in a long-term plan. So, for example, our open space level of service is there to help developers when they're providing us with a playground or a reserve, and so needs to have quite a lot of information around what's acceptable, which wouldn't be appropriate to have in a long-term plan, but is needed. And it also might be where something just has a high level of community interest, and so we're often responding to requests around particular things. So say, for example, we have a public location level of service, public toilet location level of service policy, because it is a query that comes up a lot. And then moving into the description part, you've got a bit in strike through there, which has just been rephrased a bit more concisely in the first bullet. And we've updated some of the language here to just note that relationship with the calculation of development contributions. In 6.4, we've updated the strategic context to reflect the new name, and just pointing out as well that we will consider the approach to transitioning to a different level of service, and the need to consider the criteria in the next paragraph when doing that. We've also, in the next paragraph, identified that when you're transitioning to a different level of service, that may be outlined in the infrastructure strategy or the financial strategy or the activity section within the long-term plan, just to help people, the community, when they read this, know, well, how would I find out where that decision is?
So just referencing back to the previous question, what was in 6.9 is now in 6.5, pretty much word for word.
And then just a addition there around performance measures. So as Jeremy talked earlier, performance measures are an important part of the level of service approach, I guess, in the sense that it needs to measure what you're trying to provide. So just providing some information there. And then in the differentiated levels of service section, we've needed to update that to reflect the strategic direction. So having the ability there to consider if you would want a higher level of service in order to reflect the strategic direction. So that could be, for example, in our special ecological areas, you might have a higher level of service to reflect their special character. And then we also have updated the intensification areas to reference the high density residential zone change with Plan Change 33. There will be a little bit of crossover potentially just with some of the planning that was done before Plan Change 33. It was around spatial plan areas, and so not all of the spatial plan area will be a high density residential zone, but because the spatial plans are considered part of the strategic framework as a kind of investment plan, that's then covered in that first point around being able to have a higher level of service consistent with the strategic direction of council. So we're kind of comfortable that with that change we haven't lost anything in terms of areas that might previously been considered an intensification area. And then just in the higher level of service to support special character areas, there was just a comment that further criteria would be developed over time. We had a little think about whether we felt that needed to be done, and I think because this decision sits with council about setting a level of service, that providing the intent of what we're meaning there in terms of the unique characteristics of the area in the definition section should be sufficient, as the decision still is with council in order to set that level of service. So that's most of the changes for now. Should we hop into the workshop session? So we've got two examples here, and on the left are the criteria that are in the policy, and on the right are some illustrative examples of what it would lead us to look to provide the advice. The examples, one is around setting a level of service, which uses the Auckland Council example of public rubbish collection, just topical. And then the other one is around the play spaces. So earlier this year, you were brought analysis around upgrading certain play spaces and parks, and so it's using that as an example of the policy criteria and what was provided. So you've got some post-its. Happy to have thoughts on anything here that you feel the criteria is, could be amended, or if anything's missing. The analysis is largely my own, so if I have forgotten or didn't know about important public rubbish collection matters, I apologise. Please do not hold the waste team accountable.
I think there's two elements to that. One is what you can do. Sometimes getting satisfaction is easier than others, and sometimes getting quantitative is easier than others. And also around this table, consistency is not easy. So it's got to stay simple and blunt. Yep, and I think in each of these conversations you might end up with 10 different opinions around this table. Should it be more weighted around what we're delivering, widgets, or how happy people are? Which is generally what happens, and we'll come back to you through the LTP process and say, we've had a look through, this is what we've kept.
Me, I should have just popped through an email to you, so you've got those handouts too. Just mindful, we need to finish on time, so 2 more minutes just to wrap up thoughts.
Can we bring it back, Mr. Chair? Glenn, you, Steve, are we getting closer?
I did give them 2 minutes.
You got to give them 2. Oh, okay.
Now, I'm aware that we've got another workshop straight after, so if you can also post-it any thoughts, that's really helpful, because then I can also refer to the post-its if we're short on time. So, all right. All right, I had a request that you be first up, is that right, Councillor Morris?
Presentation made, that's all right. We looked at both, but in terms of the public waste collection level of service. We were playing a bit of, Arthur and I are playing a bit of 4D chess over here, and the level of service is unable to flex according to demand or incentives for recycling. So consumers, residents, they can't increase the level of service through a pay per lift situation where, you know, if the truck came around weekly, if they are heavy users, or they can't reduce their own individual level of service through pay per lift if they're very good at recycling and may only want a general waste collection once every 6 weeks.
So those are
So that's I think that that's why I bring in the 4D chess element. That's a consumer orientated, consumer demand level of service. We're going right into neoliberalism here, Arohamai. Arthur, you know, the individual consumer is able to determine the level of service through their actions.
And those conversations were had when we talked about the residential collection, and it is 4D chess. We tried to make this more simple by talking about public place recycling or public place waste collection rather than residential one. Read the bloody question.
I think just really focused on the criteria on the left and whether that's driving this type of information that you're wanting us to provide you with on the right. So the left is the criteria and the policy, and the right is kind of how we've given you an example of what that might lead us to present you with. So in this case of public waste collection, for the strategic context, we'd be looking to our waste minimisation and management plan, our environment strategy, our Tauranga Moana iwi management plan, and our climate action investment plan to draw from there the position statements that would inform the analysis. And then equally, as we go through, that's the kind of information we'd be drawing from to present you with when you're making those decisions. So just making sure that those criteria on the left are what you think we should be providing in terms of that analysis.
One of the things that is about, like with the play spaces, is different communities have different ideas of play space, like the elderly to children, stuff like that. Is that covered here as far as satisfaction?
So there is, in terms of the, I guess the criteria around the impact of the lower level of service on community wellbeing and achievement and outcomes of achievement of community outcomes and strategies, but it is less direct than if you're, you know, initially talking to the community. So I guess there's a choice in this policy around when you get that community voice, because remembering that you will need to consult on a level of service potentially under that significance and engagement model. So there is a little bit of a choice around whether you need to have that pre-engagement ahead of setting the level of service or whether you do it on the level of service. And I guess in these criteria examples, we are drawing from existing voice in terms of strategic kind of material that has already incorporated the views of the community, and also things like the customer feedback through complaints or praise in order to develop that analysis. But if you were wanting to have more certainty around the views of the community ahead of setting a level of service, that is an option. It just means that it then becomes like a two-stage situation.
Because isn't there the risk of marginalising like disabled people not having a play space?
Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of strategic context comes in terms of like the inclusive city strategy and our action and investment plans around accessibility. So there definitely would be that analysis from the perspective of what we've heard before from the community, but you may not get that exact consultation on the particular level of service that you're talking about. You would once you get to the consultation phase. I guess there's just a choice around, do you want to have that voice at the point that you're considering your options or when you're going out to the community with options?
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Councillor Crowley, you're the last question.
Well, it's more comment, if I can, because I guess unlike our colleagues on our left, we stuck to 2D drafts or something. But in terms of sort of the left-hand column, to me that often the problem is that we can say, yeah, that looks good, but then it all depends what happens in the right-hand column. So firstly, I'd say the differential between community and stakeholders is critical in terms of the way it flows through. And what you highlighted before, I'd agree would be a critical decision point for someone, whether it's us or at a staff level. But I think that's going to change the whole dynamic for some things we'd try to set a level of service on. In terms of the example on waste, I would say what I've noticed in TCC policies and levels of service is sometimes it's a really well-constructed policy framework. There's good strategic framework now, there's good policies, but it's only at the final step of do we actually get what it is we're trying to do as a community that it falls down. So for instance, in the public waste, basically we're trying to reduce waste to landfill, but is there actually a measure there that's driving the whole thing to do that? And I think often that's where the voice of the community comes in to sort of, sometimes we may not even know. Like in that example, it might be clear, but in some examples, it's really sort of so complex, it's hard to always know exactly what it is we're trying to prioritise and where to prioritise the funds, because ultimately it's all about a trade-off of funds at the end of the day. So to me, that would probably be a key thing to keep in mind is, what is the final goal here that we're trying to get to, because you could do an amazing set of policy work, but putting it simply, like in the past, there'd be councils that didn't have all this wonderful stuff, but may have delivered a better outcome or not, but they wouldn't have known how to measure it, but they might have actually done a better job because we put so much time into the policy and maybe not into actually just going, let's just spend the money, do this, bite the bullet and get the outcome we want. And I suppose I'm just maybe exaggerating a little bit, but to make the point that we have to be really careful to get a focused, targeted outcome that we want that's best value for money.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Commentary for yourselves as far as this is the framework. When you apply the framework to actual things, keep those things in mind.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Vicky.
Just one last question. Is there anything different to what you received on the 5th of May that you'd like to see on the X of August when we bring this back to you? Based on this conversation, I'm not picking up a lot of change, but it's just better understanding now. We're happy to bring back pretty much what we brought to you in the 5th of May, and we can go from
I
there.
was very happy with the original document. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
As we go forward with more private-public partnership, does this element become negotiable? Does this become something that we say this must be? You have to deliver this for the city. You know what I mean?
I would have thought that was our starting point for negotiations, and then we'll have a conversation after that. But I mean, that then comes into this room as to how you want to stick to your guns.
Yeah, okay.